November 10th, 1944, Camp Wheeler, Wisconsin. The mess hall line stretched 28 women long, 28 shadows of what women used to be. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, bones pressing against skin like prisoners trying to escape their own bodies. Margareta Hoffman stood seventh in line. She had stopped counting days somewhere over the Atlantic, when the transport ship's hold became a tomb of groaning women and the smell of sickness. 6 weeks of crossing. 6 weeks of thin soup that tasted like dishwater. 6 weeks of bread so hard it could crack teeth. Now she stood in this American prisoner of war camp, and her stomach had given up hoping. Hope required energy. Energy required food. Food had become a memory. The November wind howled outside the wooden building, but inside, something else filled the air. Something Greta had forgotten existed. Warmth. Real warmth. And a smell. She breathed in and felt her knees weaken. Butter. Cream. Something savory and rich that made her mouth water for the first time in months. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The memory of fullness. The memory of satisfaction. The memory of sitting at her mother's table in Dresden when food was celebration and not survival. The line moved forward, one woman at a time. Each step brought her closer to whatever awaited at the serving counter. Greta had prepared herself for punishment rations, stale bread, watered-down broth, perhaps nothing at all. She knew what Germany did to enemy prisoners. She had heard the whispers, seen the haunted looks of soldiers returning from the Eastern Front. Enemies deserved suffering. That was the natural order of war. She expected the Americans to be the same, perhaps worse. Goebbels had promised they would be worse. Monsters without mercy, beasts who would starve them, violate them, leave them to rot in frozen camps until their bones turned to dust. The line moved again. Now she could see the serving counter. A large American soldier stood behind it, holding a serving spoon the size of a small shovel. His name tag read Aldrich. He was stocky, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of outdoor work and honest labor. Farm country, Greta thought. This man grew up knowing soil and seasons and the weight of a full day's work. But it was his expression that confused her most. He was smiling, not a cruel smile. Not the predatory grin of a man about to deny food to starving prisoners. This was something else entirely, something that looked almost like cheerfulness. The woman ahead of Greta reached the counter. Ilse Kessler, 22 years old, daughter of a baker whose shop had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombs. Ilse weighed perhaps 85 pounds now, down from 130 before the war. Her collarbone jutted out like a shelf beneath her thin skin. Corporal Franklin Aldrich looked at Ilse with that strange smile. Then he lifted his enormous spoon and deposited a mountain of something onto her tin plate. The food was pale yellow, steaming, topped with what appeared to be golden breadcrumbs that glistened with butter. The portion was so large it nearly spilled over the edges. Ilse stood frozen. Her hands trembled. The plate shook so violently that Greta thought she might drop it. From somewhere behind her, Greta heard Wilhelmine Hartmann gasp. The sound cut through the silence like a knife through paper. This had to be a mistake. A test, perhaps. Some cruel American joke where they would show the starving women food, real food, impossible amounts of food, and then snatch it away while laughing at the desperate hope in their prisoners' eyes. Corporal Aldrich gestured at the plate with his spoon. "Tuna casserole," he said in English. "Good stuff, my ma's recipe." Ilse did not move, could not move. She stared at the steaming plate like it was a hallucination, a fever dream conjured by her starving mind. Aldrich's smile faltered slightly, replaced by confusion. He spoke again, more slowly this time, as if volume and pace could bridge the gap between languages. "You eat?" he said, pointing at the food, then at Ilse's mouth. "Go on, it's good." Ilse shuffled away from the counter in a daze, clutching her plate like it might evaporate. Greta stepped forward to take her place. Up close, Corporal Franklin Aldrich smelled like butter and onions and something yeasty, like fresh bread. Clean smells, good smells, the smells of a kitchen where someone cared about feeding people, not just keeping them alive. He looked at Greta, and his smile returned, warm, genuine, without a trace of malice. Then he lifted his spoon and buried it in the massive pot behind him. The portion he deposited on her plate was identical to Ilse's. A small mountain of creamy casserole topped with crispy breadcrumbs, steam rising from its surface like morning mist over a lake. The plate was heavy, so heavy. Greta had forgotten food could have weight. She stared at it, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to process what was happening. Behind her, Ketta Vogt found her voice. Her English was halting but functional, learned from years of teaching school before the war consumed everything. "This," Ketta said, pointing at Greta's heaping plate. "All this? For us?" Corporal Aldrich looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Well, sure," he said, as if the answer were obvious, as if feeding enemies was the most natural thing in the world. "Can't have you ladies going hungry." He paused, gestured toward the massive pot behind him, still more than half full. "There's plenty more if you want seconds." Seconds, the word hung in the air like an impossible promise. Seconds implied that this first serving was not a mistake, not a singular indulgence, not a cruel joke. Seconds meant abundance. Seconds meant more. Seconds meant that somewhere in this American camp there was enough food that enemies could ask for additional portions without fear of punishment. Greta carried her plate to the nearest table and sat down slowly. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if any sudden motion might cause this strange dream to dissolve into the familiar nightmare of hunger. The other women followed. One by one, they emerged from the serving line, bearing impossibly full plates. They sat in clusters at the long wooden tables, 28 German prisoners staring at more food than most had seen in months. Nobody moved to take a first bite. They simply could not believe this was real. Wilhelmina Hartmann, called Minna by everyone who knew her, was the first to break. She sat directly across from Greta, her plate untouched, and began to cry. Tears rolled down her gaunt cheeks and dripped onto the steaming casserole below. She made no sound, just sat there, weeping silently, while 27 other women watched and felt their own tears threatening to fall. Minna was 28 years old. Before the war, she had been the best cook in her village outside Hamburg. Her spätzle was legendary. Her sauerbraten made grown men weep with pleasure. She had married a carpenter named Wilhelm, who laughed easily and built beautiful furniture and died somewhere on the frozen steppes of Russia, his body never recovered, his grave unmarked. Her hands bore the calluses of a lifetime spent kneading dough. Thick and yellowed, they told the story of thousands of loaves baked, thousands of meals prepared, thousands of people fed. Now those hands trembled over a plate of American casserole while tears fell like rain. Now Minna sat in an American prison camp crying over a plate of tuna casserole because kindness had become more shocking than cruelty. The silence stretched. The food steamed. Nobody ate. Then Ilse Kessler closed her eyes and lifted her fork. The first bite changed everything. Her expression transformed. Not just from hunger satisfied, but from something deeper. The shock of tasting cream, real cream, mixed with pasta that had been cooked until perfectly tender. Chunks of actual fish, not the mysterious paste that passed for protein in German military rations. A crispy topping that added texture and richness. This was food made by someone who cared, someone who believed that eating should be pleasure, not merely survival. "Gott im Himmel," Ilse whispered. Her eyes remained closed. Her fork moved again, almost involuntarily. Another bite, then another. She could not stop herself. Around the table, her surrender gave permission to the others. Forks began to move. Slowly at first, tentatively, then with increasing urgency as months of deprivation met American abundance. Greta tasted the casserole and felt her carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. The dish was rich and savory, filling in a way that went beyond mere calories. The cream sauce coated her tongue like velvet. The noodles were soft and buttery. The tuna was real, actual fish with texture and flavor and substance. But more than the individual components, it was the sheer generosity of the portion that undid her. This was not survival rations grudgingly distributed. This was not the bare minimum required by international law. This was food meant to nourish, to comfort, to satisfy. This was food made with love. The realization struck Greta like a physical blow. Her enemy was feeding her better than her own country had fed her in years. How was that possible? How could everything she had been told about Americans be wrong? At the next table, 19-year-old Hannelore Voigt was eating with the desperate speed of someone who expected her food to be taken away at any moment. Hannah was the youngest of the group, barely out of childhood, drafted into the Women's Auxiliary Corps because Germany had run out of men. She had lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front. Her father had disappeared into the chaos of the final defensive lines. She had nothing left but hunger and fear. Now she scraped her plate clean and looked toward the serving line with desperate hope in her eyes. "He said something," Hannah whispered in German. "In English. Something about more?" She looked to Keta, whose English was best among them. "Did he say we could have more?" Keta nodded slowly. Her expression was troubled, as if the answer disturbed her more than the question. "He said there is plenty. He said we could have seconds." Seconds. The word spread through the mess hall like fire through dry grass. 28 women looked at their empty or emptying plates, then at the serving line where Corporal Franklin Aldrich still stood beside his enormous pot. The internal struggle played out on every face. Pride warred with hunger. Pride warred. Suspicion battled against the memory of that first, incredible taste. German discipline fought against very human need. Nobody moved. The silence stretched. Then Minna Hartmann stood up. She walked to the serving line with her empty plate. Her hands trembled. Her chin was raised, but her eyes glistened with tears that threatened to spill. Corporal Aldrich smiled at her approach. "Ready for seconds?" he asked. Minna did not understand the words, but she understood the gesture when he lifted his spoon toward the pot. She held out her plate like an offering. He filled it again, just as generously as before. Minna returned to her table with her second portion and sat down heavily. She stared at the plate for a long moment. Then she began to eat and to cry. Both at the same time. One by one, the other women rose and made the same journey. One by one, they returned with full plates and wet cheeks. One by one, they discovered what it felt like to eat without fear. By the time the meal ended, the massive pot was nearly empty. Corporal Franklin Aldrich surveyed his work with quiet satisfaction. He had no idea that he had just participated in something extraordinary. To him it was simply Tuesday, simply feeding people who were hungry, simply doing what his mother had taught him to do since childhood. But to 28 German women, November 10th, 1944 became the day everything changed. The day an enemy said seconds. the day they began to question everything. To understand why a simple plate of tuna casserole could reduce battle-hardened women to tears, one must understand what hunger had become in the final year of the war. Greta Hoffmann grew up in Dresden, the daughter of a postal clerk named Heinrich and a seamstress named Elsa. Her childhood memories were filled with the smells of her mother's kitchen, sauerbraten simmering in the pot for hours, filling the apartment with the aroma of vinegar and cloves and rich brown meat. Fresh Brötchen from the bakery down the street, still warm from the oven, the crust crackling as she tore it apart. Kartoffelsalat on summer evenings, when the windows stood open and the sound of neighbors' laughter drifted up from the courtyard below. Food had been celebration, comfort, a daily reminder of home and family and all the simple pleasures that made life worth living. By 1943, it had become an obsession that consumed every waking thought. The ration cards that governed civilian life in Germany had grown increasingly worthless as the war dragged on. In the early years, they had promised butter, meat, bread, sugar, all the building blocks of a decent diet. But promises required delivery. Delivery required supply chains. Supply chains required resources that were being devoured by a war on two fronts. Butter became a memory. Meat appeared perhaps once every 2 weeks, if at all. Eggs became currency more valuable than Reichsmarks. The bread grew darker and harder, stretched with sawdust and other fillers that provided bulk but no nutrition. Greta's mother learned to make soup from potato peels. She learned to stretch a single egg across 3 days of meals. She learned to smile and say she was not hungry when there was not enough for everyone at the table. Her mother had a name for the darkest days. When there was nothing left but potato peels boiled until they dissolved into murky liquid, Elsa called it brown flour soup. "It's nutritious," she would say, forcing a smile. "The brown color means vitamins." Greta knew it was a lie, but she ate the brown flour soup and pretended to believe because pretending was all they had left. "I already ate," Elsa would say on other days. "You children need it more." Greta knew her mother was lying then, too. The hollows in her cheeks told the truth. The way her wedding ring slipped loose on fingers grown thin told the truth. The way she moved more slowly, tired more easily, aged more rapidly than a woman in her 40s should age. Still, they considered themselves fortunate. They were not starving, not like the people in the occupied territories where German soldiers claimed the best of everything and left scraps for the conquered. Not like the cities that had been bombed into rubble, where survivors picked through wreckage, searching for anything edible. The Hoffmanns had a roof, they had ration cards, they had enough. Enough to survive, not enough to live. When Greta joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in the spring of 1943, she told herself it was patriotic duty that motivated her. Germany needed everyone to contribute. The men were fighting and dying at the front. The women must keep the machinery of war running behind the lines. In truth, the promise of regular meals had been equally compelling. Military personnel received better rations than civilians. Greta had heard the numbers whispered between neighbors, discussed in hushed tones at the market where empty shelves mocked the housewives who queued for hours. Soldiers received 1,800 calories per day. Civilians received 800 if they were lucky. The mathematics of hunger were brutally simple. Joining the military meant eating. Eating meant surviving. Surviving meant seeing another day, another month, another year. So Greta reported for duty and became a communications specialist. She learned to operate radio equipment and cipher machines, to send and receive messages in codes that kept shifting, to maintain the information networks that connected the scattered units of a fragmenting army. The work was technical, precise, far removed from the actual violence of combat. She could tell herself she was serving her country without directly contributing to the deaths of others. She could pretend that the messages she transmitted were neutral harmless, merely words and numbers that meant nothing beyond their immediate function. She could pretend. The other women in her unit had similar stories. Ilse Kessler had joined because her family's bakery was destroyed in an air raid. The same bombs that killed her father and older brother also reduced 4 generations of family business to smoking rubble. There was nothing left, no home, no livelihood, no reason to stay. The military offered food and shelter and purpose. Ilse accepted all 3 without hesitation. Kette Vogt had sought escape from a father who drank away what little money the family possessed. Her teaching career had been cut short by the war. Her dreams of university had died with the young men who would have been her classmates, their bodies fertilizing fields from Poland to Stalingrad. In the women's auxiliary course, nobody asked about her family. Nobody expected her to care for a drunk who cursed her for being born female. Minna Hartmann had lost her husband Wilhelm in February of 1943. The telegram came on a Tuesday. 3 sentences: regret to inform, killed in action, service to the fatherland, no body, no grave, no chance to say goodbye. The military gave her something to do with her hands, gave her people to feed, supplies to organize, tasks to complete, gave her reasons to get out of bed in the morning. Hannelore Voigt had lost 2 brothers before she turned 18. Johann fell at Kursk. Friedrich died somewhere near Kiev, the exact location unknown, the circumstances unclear. Hannah wanted to feel she was doing something, anything. Her brothers had given their lives. The least she could do was contribute her labor. None of them were ideologues. None were true believers in the Reich's grand vision of Aryan supremacy and thousand-year empires. They were young women trying to survive in a world that had grown increasingly desperate and dark. They were daughters and sisters and widows and orphans, caught up in currents too powerful to resist. They were hungry. The hunger never stopped. Even with military rations, even with 1,800 calories instead of 800, the hunger was always there, a constant companion, a persistent ache that colored every thought and weighted every decision. By the autumn of 1944, even military rations had deteriorated. The communications unit to which Greta was assigned moved constantly as Allied forces advanced through France and Belgium. Supply lines stretched thin and then broke entirely. Some days brought nothing but weak coffee and a handful of dried peas. Other days brought stale bread and mysterious meat that nobody wanted to examine too closely. Greta learned to ignore the constant gnawing in her stomach, learned to function despite the light-headedness that came from too many days without adequate nutrition. Learned to tell herself that tomorrow would be better, that relief would come, that the Reich would find a way to feed its soldiers. She learned to lie to herself with increasing skill. Their capture came almost as a relief. October 1944. A small village in Belgium whose name Greta never learned. American forces had encircled the area, cutting off all routes of escape. The unit's commanding officer, a weary captain who looked 20 years older than his actual age, gathered his personnel and made the decision that would save their lives. "We surrender," he said. "We cannot win, we cannot escape, and I will not see you killed in a pointless last stand." Some of the younger soldiers protested. They had been told that surrender was dishonor, that Americans tortured their prisoners, that death was preferable to capture. The captain silenced them with a look. "The propaganda is lies," he said quietly. "Most of it, perhaps all of it. The Americans follow the Geneva Convention. They will feed us, house us, keep us alive until this madness ends." He was right. The American soldiers who accepted their surrender were efficient, almost businesslike. They took weapons, checked identification papers, separated officers from enlisted personnel, men from women, loaded everyone onto trucks without excessive force or unnecessary cruelty. There was no torture, no humiliation, no violence beyond what was required to ensure compliance. But then came the transport ship. 6 weeks crossing the Atlantic in conditions that made Greta wonder if the captain had been wrong about everything. The hold was crowded, the air was foul, the food was barely sufficient to keep the prisoners alive. Thin soup, hard bread, water that tasted of rust and salt. Greta lost track of how many pounds she shed during the crossing, lost track of the women who fell ill and were taken away to some shipboard infirmary, never to return. Lost track of the days that blurred together into an endless grey monotony of hunger and cold, and the constant pitch of the ship as it crossed hostile waters. By the time they reached American shores, she had stopped hoping for anything beyond mere survival. By the time the trucks carried them to Camp Wheeler, she had prepared herself for the worst. Instead, she found a stocky corporal from Minnesota who smiled and asked if she wanted seconds. Corporal Franklin Aldrich had grown up on a dairy farm where the winters lasted half the year and the work never stopped. His mother, a woman named Martha, who stood barely 5 feet tall but commanded respect from everyone who knew her, had raised 7 children on that farm, 7 mouths to feed, 7 bodies to clothe, 7 futures to nurture in a household where money was always tight and love was the only currency that never ran short. Martha Aldrich had a philosophy about feeding people. It was simple and absolute and non-negotiable. To turn someone away hungry, she would say, is a sin worse than most of the offences the minister mentions on Sunday. She meant it. The Aldrich farm became known throughout 3 counties as a place where anyone could find a meal, travelling salesmen. Neighbours fallen on hard times, hobos riding the rails during the Depression years, even the occasional stranger whose background was unclear and whose intentions might have been questionable. Martha fed them all. Franklin remembered one evening in particular. He was 12 years old. A man had appeared at their door, gaunt and hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that hung loose on a frame that had once been larger. He asked if there was any work he could do in exchange for food. Martha invited him in without hesitation, set him at the table, served him roast chicken and mashed potatoes and 3 kinds of vegetables and a slice of pie that was meant for tomorrow's lunch. The man ate like someone who had forgotten what a full stomach felt like. Ate until he could barely move. Then he sat back and tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. "Mom," he said, "I got to tell you something. I just got out of prison, 5 years for stealing. I wasn't sure anyone would feed me, knowing what I am." Franklin watched his mother's face, watched for the fear or disgust or regret that should have appeared at this revelation. Instead, Martha Aldrich simply smiled. A hungry belly doesn't know what crimes the man attached to it might have committed, she said. Food is for everyone. That's how the good Lord made it. Franklin absorbed this philosophy so completely that he barely recognized it as philosophy at all. It was simply how decent people behaved. You fed the hungry, you clothed the naked, you sheltered the stranger. These were not heroic acts, but basic requirements of being human. When the army assigned him to kitchen duty at Camp Wheeler in the autumn of 1944, Franklin brought his mother's convictions with him. The camp itself was a hastily constructed facility designed to house the unexpected influx of German prisoners. Most of it held men, thousands of them, captured in the fighting across France and Belgium, but a small section had been set aside for the women who posed unique logistical challenges for military bureaucracy. Female prisoners required separate barracks, female guards when possible, strict rules about interactions between male staff and prisoners, different protocols for everything from medical care to discipline. The arrival of 28 German women in early November had thrown the local command into confusion. Nobody knew quite what to do with them. Nobody had planned for this contingency. Captain Ruth Pemberton, assigned to oversee the women's section, had done her best to create appropriate accommodations. She was a practical woman from Boston who had taught high school mathematics before the war, and she approached problems with the same logical precision she had once applied to quadratic equations. Separate barracks, check. Female guards, check, mostly. Clear rules about conduct, check. Medical examinations upon arrival, check. But nobody had thought much about the food. Franklin had taken one look at the standard prison rations being proposed and declared them unacceptable. "These are women who've been half-starved," he told Captain Pemberton during his first week at the camp. "Some of them look like they haven't had a decent meal in months, maybe years. We feed them like this and we'll have sick prisoners on our hands. Sick prisoners mean more work for everyone and possible deaths we'll have to answer for." Captain Pemberton had listened with the careful attention of someone who recognized expertise when she encountered it. "What do you suggest, Corporal?" "Let me cook for them proper. Good food. Filling food. The kind of stuff that puts weight on bones and strength in muscles. I know we're supposed to just keep them alive until the war ends, but there's keeping alive and there's keeping human. These women need both." The captain considered his words, considered the regulations, considered the potential complications of treating enemy prisoners better than strictly necessary. Then she nodded. "I'll authorize additional supplies from the main commissary. Within reason, Corporal. We're not running a restaurant." Franklin had taken that authorization and treated it as permission to operate his kitchen exactly as his mother had operated hers, with abundance, with generosity, with the firm belief that good food could heal more than just physical hunger. The camp kitchen was nothing fancy. A large room with industrial stoves, enormous pots, and metal shelving stacked with more supplies than most civilians had seen in years. Franklin walked through it each morning with something approaching reverence. Canned tuna by the case, sacks of flour and sugar and potatoes that seemed bottomless, powdered milk and eggs preserved in solutions that somehow kept them fresh, vegetables in quantities that would have seemed obscene to anyone who had lived through German rationing. This was American abundance, the productive capacity of a nation whose farmland had never seen bombardment, whose factories had never been targeted by enemy planes, whose supply chains remained intact even as it fed armies on two fronts. On November 10, 1944, Franklin prepared his mother's tuna casserole for the German women. It was a simple dish: canned tuna, egg noodles, a cream sauce made from butter and flour and powdered milk, a topping of breadcrumbs toasted in more butter until golden and crisp. Nothing fancy, just honest comfort food meant to stick to the ribs and provide genuine nourishment. He had no way of knowing that this simple recipe would become the foundation for everything that followed. Dr. Howard Brennan arrived at Camp Wheeler 3 days after the German women. He was 45 years old, originally from Philadelphia, with the kind of quiet competence that came from 2 decades of medical practice. Before the war, he had specialized in internal medicine, treating patients whose ailments required careful observation and methodical intervention rather than dramatic surgery. The army had assigned him to prisoner of war camps because someone had recognized that treating malnourished captives required exactly his kind of patient, systematic approach. On November 13th, he conducted his first comprehensive examinations of the 28 German women. The results confirmed what Franklin Aldrich's instincts had already suggested. Greta Hoffman, age 24, height 5 feet 5 inches, weight 89 pounds. Dr. Brennan wrote the numbers in his careful handwriting and calculated the body mass index. 14.8. Severe malnutrition, just above the threshold where the human body began consuming its own muscles for fuel. He examined her skin for signs of vitamin deficiency, found the subtle indicators of inadequate nutrition that only trained eyes would notice, checked her teeth, her hair, her fingernails, all telling the same story of a body that had been running on empty for far too long. "How long since you've eaten regularly?" he asked through the interpreter, a young lieutenant named Dorothy Stone, who spoke German with a Bavarian accent learned from her grandmother. Greta considered the question. What counted as regularly? She could not remember. Before the war, she finally answered. Before 1939, perhaps. Dr. Brennan nodded and made another note. He had heard similar answers from other prisoners. The German civilian population had been slowly starving for years, and the military personnel had only slightly better. The ration system was failing, the supply chains were collapsing, the entire infrastructure of feeding a nation had broken down. He moved to the next patient, Ilse Kessler, 5 feet 4 inches, 87 pounds, BMI 14.2, then Minna Hartmann, 5 feet 6 inches, 93 pounds, BMI 15.0, then Hannelore Voigt, the youngest, just 19 years old, 5 feet 2 inches, 81 pounds, BMI 14.8. The numbers told a story of systematic deprivation, not the acute starvation of a siege or a famine, but the chronic malnutrition of a society where food had become weapon, where calories were rationed not just for efficiency but for control. After completing all 28 examinations, Dr. Brennan requested a meeting with Captain Pemberton and Corporal Aldrich. "The situation is serious, but not critical," he explained, spreading his notes across the captain's desk. "Most of these women are severely malnourished, but they're not at immediate risk of death. With proper nutrition, they should recover fully within 3 to 4 months. "What do you need from us?" Captain Pemberton asked. "Patience and careful management of their food intake." Dr. Brennan turned to Franklin. "Corporal, I understand you've been feeding them generously. That's good. They need calories. But there's a complication." "What kind of complication?" "It's called refeeding syndrome. When a body has been starved for extended periods, it adapts to running on very little fuel. If you suddenly flood it with food, the metabolic shock can cause serious problems: heart failure, respiratory distress, seizures, in extreme cases, death." Franklin felt his stomach drop. He had been trying to help. Had he been hurting them instead? "Should I reduce the portions?" Dr. Brennan shook his head. "No. The psychological impact of abundance is important. These women need to believe that food will keep coming, that nobody will take it away, that asking for more is safe." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "What I need you to do is maintain the generous portions but encourage them to eat slowly. Multiple, smaller meals rather than fewer large ones. Let them see the full plates, feel the abundance, but guide them toward a healthier pattern of consumption." Franklin nodded. It made sense. Feed the body and the spirit both, but do it wisely. "I'll also be supplementing with vitamins and monitoring their weight weekly," Dr. Brennan continued. "If anyone shows signs of refeeding syndrome, we'll adjust accordingly, but with careful management, they should all recover." The doctor gathered his papers and prepared to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at Franklin. "What you're doing matters, Corporal, more than you might realize. These women have been treated as less than human for years, told that their enemies are monsters, told that capture means torture and death. Every meal you serve them is evidence that everything they believed was a lie." Franklin thought about that as he returned to his kitchen. Thought about the tears he had seen streaming down gaunt faces as the women tasted his mother's tuna casserole. Thought about the way their hands had trembled when they dared to ask for seconds. He understood something then that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Feeding people was not just about filling stomachs. It was about feeding souls, about proving that kindness existed even in the darkest times, about demonstrating that enemies could treat each other as human beings. Every generous portion was a small rebellion against the hatred that had set the world on fire. Every second helping was a statement of faith in something better. By November 25, 1944, the routine at Camp Wheeler had found its rhythm. The German women woke at 6, dressed in the plain but serviceable clothes provided by the camp, walked through the bitter Wisconsin cold to the mess hall where Corporal Franklin Aldrich waited with breakfast, scrambled eggs made from powdered eggs that somehow tasted better than they had any right to, toast with real butter spread thick, oatmeal sweetened with brown sugar, coffee strong and hot in quantities that seemed limitless. They ate slowly now, following Dr. Brennan's guidance, but they ate well. Lunch came at noon. Sandwiches with actual meat, soup made from scratch with vegetables that had color and flavor and substance, cookies, sometimes, passed out by Franklin with a smile and a nod that needed no translation. Dinner was the main event. This was when Franklin showcased his skills. Pot roast that fell apart at the touch of a fork, chicken fried steak with cream gravy, meatloaf seasoned with onions and herbs, mashed potatoes whipped until fluffy, vegetables cooked with bacon fat the way his mother had taught him, and always, at least once a week, the tuna casserole that had started everything. Greta found herself looking forward to meals with an anticipation she had almost forgotten was possible. The gnawing hunger that had been her constant companion for years was slowly, gradually, incredibly fading. In its place came something else, something she struggled to name. It felt like hope. It felt dangerous. On November the 25th, 15 days after her arrival, Dr. Brennan weighed her again. 93 pounds, a gain of 4 pounds in just over 2 weeks. "Excellent progress," he said, noting the number in his careful records. "Your body is responding well. No signs of refeeding syndrome. Will continue at this pace." Greta nodded. She had learned enough English by now to understand simple sentences, though she still relied on Lieutenant Stone for anything complex. But one question burned in her mind, a question she had been afraid to ask, a question that haunted her during the long nights in the barracks when sleep would not come. "Why?" she finally said. The single word carried the weight of everything she could not articulate. Dr. Brennan understood. He had heard variations of this question from every prisoner he had ever treated. "Because you are a human being," he answered simply. "Because hunger does not discriminate between friend and enemy. Because treating prisoners well is not just moral but practical. And because the man cooking your food was raised by a woman who believed that turning away the hungry was a sin." Greta absorbed this, turned it over in her mind, tried to reconcile it with everything she had been told about Americans, about enemies, about the nature of war. She failed. Everything was wrong. Everything she had believed, everything she had been taught, everything the radio broadcasts and newspaper editorials and party officials had proclaimed with such certainty. The Americans were not monsters. The Americans were not beasts without mercy. The Americans were Franklin Aldrich, who smiled when he asked if she wanted seconds. Dr. Howard Brennan, who treated her damaged body with patience and skill. Captain Ruth Pemberton, who ensured that female prisoners were housed separately and protected from harassment. The Americans were human beings who followed rules and showed kindness and believed that even enemies deserved food and shelter and basic dignity, which meant that either the Americans were exceptional or the propaganda was lies. Greta was beginning to suspect it was the latter. In the barracks that night, she lay awake while the other women slept and thought about her mother's last letter. The one that had arrived just before her capture, written on paper so thin it was almost transparent, in handwriting that wavered with fatigue or emotion or both. "We are managing," her mother had written. "Your father's ration card allows us 150 grams of bread daily. We are fortunate, compared to many, 150 grams of bread." Greta thought about the breakfast she had eaten that morning. The eggs and toast and oatmeal and coffee. More food in a single meal than her parents received in an entire day. She thought about her mother making brown flour soup from potato peels, stretching a single egg across 3 days, lying about not being hungry so her children could eat. And she thought about the steaming plate of tuna casserole that had appeared before her 15 days ago, the impossible abundance of it. The casual generosity of a man who asked if she wanted seconds. The mathematics of hunger were brutally clear. American abundance versus German scarcity. Enemy kindness versus homeland deprivation. The prisoners eating better than the citizens. Something was very, very wrong. And Greta was only beginning to understand how wrong it truly was. But what she would learn in the coming months would shatter everything she thought she knew about her country and about herself. December arrived with temperatures that dropped below zero and winds that howled across the Wisconsin plains like wounded animals. Inside the camp kitchen, the air was warm with steam and the smell of bread baking. Minna Hartman stood at the counter beside Corporal Franklin Aldrich, her hands buried in a mound of flour and dough. She had asked to help in the kitchen 3 weeks earlier. The request came through gestures and broken English, a pantomime of cooking motions and pleading eyes that needed no translation. Franklin had consulted Captain Pemberton, who had consulted regulations, who had found nothing that explicitly prohibited a prisoner from assisting with food preparation under supervision. So Minna came to the kitchen each morning at 5, 2 hours before the other women woke. She worked beside Franklin in a silence that gradually became comfortable. Two people who did not share a language but shared something more fundamental. They both understood food. Minna's hands moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years kneading dough. Her calluses were thick and yellowed, earned through thousands of loaves baked in her village kitchen, thousands of meals prepared for a husband who would never eat again. Franklin watched her work and recognized a kindred spirit, someone who knew that cooking was not merely labor, but love made tangible. On this particular December morning, Minna had asked permission to make something from home. Her request came through pointing at ingredients and drawing shapes in the flour dust on the counter. Eggs, flour, salt, water. Franklin nodded and stepped back to watch. Minna's hands transformed the simple ingredients into dough with practiced efficiency. She kneaded until the texture satisfied some internal standard that only she understood. Then she rolled the dough thin, cut it into small, irregular shapes, and dropped them into boiling, salted water. When the pieces floated to the surface, she scooped them out and topped them with butter that had been browned until fragrant and nutty. "Spätzle," she said, offering him a forkful. Her voice was soft, almost shy. Franklin tasted the small dumplings and felt his eyebrows rise. Simple ingredients, nothing fancy, but the technique transformed them into something special, tender and chewy and rich with buttery flavor. "Same idea," he said, pointing at his own pot of egg noodles. "Different shape." Minna smiled. It was the first real smile Franklin had seen from any of the prisoners. Not the nervous grimace of someone trying to please their captors, not the forced expression of someone going through motions. This was genuine warmth, genuine pleasure, genuine human connection. The smile changed something between them. From that morning forward, the kitchen became a place of exchange. Minna taught Franklin her grandmother's recipes. Franklin taught Minna the dishes his mother had perfected over decades. They communicated through ingredients and techniques, through tastes and textures, through the universal language of feeding people well. Spätzle joined the regular rotation alongside tuna casserole. German potato soup appeared next to American chicken and dumplings. The menu became a bridge between two cultures, two nations, two people who had been told they were enemies. Sergeant Chester Morgan, Franklin's immediate superior, observed these developments with quiet approval. He was a practical man from Oklahoma who had worked as a short-order cook before the war. He understood kitchens. He understood the bonds that formed over shared labor and shared meals. "You're doing good work, Corporal," he told Franklin one evening after dinner service. "These women are looking healthier every week." Franklin nodded, but said nothing. He had learned that talking about what he was doing sometimes diminished it. Better to simply keep cooking, keep feeding, keep proving that kindness was possible, even between enemies. The kitchen exchanges spread beyond Minna. Ketta Vogt, the former schoolteacher, began spending afternoons helping Sergeant Morgan with inventory and meal planning. Her English improved rapidly through necessity and determination. Within weeks, she could hold basic conversations. Within a month, she was translating for the other women with increasing confidence. In exchange for her help with paperwork, Morgan taught her to make American biscuits. The lesson became a standing joke between them. Light touch, Morgan demonstrated for the dozenth time. Don't work the dough, just bring it together. Ketta's German precision rebelled against the instruction. She wanted to knead thoroughly, to ensure every element was fully incorporated. The results were consistently tough and dense. You're fighting the dough, Morgan said. It's not an enemy, it's a partner. Treat it gentle. On her 15th attempt, Ketta finally understood. The biscuits emerged from the oven tall and flaky, their layers visible and distinct. Her face lit up with accomplishment. A small victory, perhaps, but small victories were all they had. In return, she taught Morgan a potato soup recipe her grandmother had made during hard times. Simple ingredients stretched to feed many. Potatoes and bacon and caraway seeds simmered until the flavors melded into something greater than their parts. Morgan tasted it and nodded with genuine appreciation. Poverty makes similar food everywhere, he observed. My grandma made something like this during the Depression. Different spices, same idea, making something good from not much. Ketta understood the observation on a level that transcended language. Scarcity was a universal teacher. Those who learned its lessons never forgot them. Private Harold Whitmore watched these developments with growing unease. He was 25 years old. His best friend Tommy had died at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. The telegram had arrived at Tommy's mother's house while Harold was still in training, preparing to ship out, counting down the days until he could join the fight. He never got the chance. A training accident had damaged his knee badly enough to make combat duty impossible. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, had assigned him to prisoner of war camp duty instead. So while other men fought and bled and died to defeat the Germans, Harold Whitmore served food to captured enemies, fed them well, kept them comfortable, watched them smile and laugh, and learned to make American biscuits. It felt like betrayal. On a cold December evening, Harold approached Franklin after dinner service. "Corporal, I need to say something." Franklin looked up from the pot he was scrubbing. His expression was neutral, patient. He had expected this conversation for weeks.
"Go ahead, Private." "I don't understand what we're doing here." Harold's voice was tight with suppressed emotion. "These people are our enemies. They killed Americans, they killed Tommy, and we're teaching them to cook? We're sharing recipes? We're treating them like guests instead of prisoners?" Franklin set down the pot and gave Harold his full attention. "You lost someone," he said. "It was not a question. My best friend, Normandy, first wave. I'm sorry." "Me? Are you?" Harold's anger flared. "Because it doesn't seem like anyone here is sorry about anything. It seems like everyone's forgotten we're at war, forgotten what these people did." Franklin was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "What did these women do, Private, specifically? What crimes did they commit?" Harold opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. He did not know. He had never asked. "They operated radios," Franklin continued.
"Sent messages, did paperwork. They weren't soldiers, weren't killers. Most of them joined because they were starving, and the military offered food. They're not monsters, Harold. They're hungry women caught up in something bigger than any of them could control. That doesn't bring Tommy back. No, it doesn't. Nothing will bring Tommy back. Nothing I cook, nothing I do, nothing that happens to these women will change what happened on that beach." But Franklin picked up the pot again, resumed scrubbing. "But I'll tell you what my mother taught me. She said that hate is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. You can spend your whole life being angry at enemies. You can starve them and hurt them and make them suffer. And at the end of it all, Tommy will still be dead. The only thing that changes is you. The only thing that suffers is your own soul. Harold stood in silence, struggling with emotions he could not name. I'm not asking you to forgive them, Franklin added. I'm not asking you to like them. I'm just asking you to be the kind of person Tommy would have been proud to call his friend. That's all any of us can do. He returned to his scrubbing, leaving Harold alone with his thoughts. The next morning, Harold was back at his station. He did not smile at the prisoners, did not engage in friendly conversation. But he filled their plates as generously as Franklin did. It was a start. December brought news that traveled through the camp like electricity through wire. The war was turning. The Germans were retreating on all fronts. Allied forces were pushing toward Berlin from the west, while the Soviets advanced from the east. The end, while not imminent, was finally visible on the horizon. For the American personnel, the news brought quiet celebration. For the German prisoners, it brought complicated emotions that defied simple description. Greta stood in the recreation hall on December 10th, listening as Keta translated a radio broadcast describing Allied advances. The other women gathered around, their faces showing a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that the war was ending, fear of what they might find when they returned home. Dresden, someone whispered. What is happening in Dresden? Nobody knew. The news was incomplete, filtered through military channels that prioritized strategic information over human interest. The women could only wait and wonder and hope. Greta thought about her parents, her mother with her potato peel soup, her father with his postal clerk's salary that bought less each month. Were they alive? Was the apartment still standing? Was there anything left to go back to? The questions had no answers, only the endless uncertainty of war. That evening, Minna found Greta sitting alone in the barracks, staring at nothing. You are thinking about home, Minna said. It was not a question. Greta nodded. Minna sat beside her on the narrow cot. For a moment, neither spoke. I think about Wilhelm, Minna finally said. My husband. He died almost 2 years ago now. Sometimes I try to remember his face and I cannot. The details fade, the sound of his laugh, the way he smelled after working in his shop. I am forgetting him, piece by piece. She paused, gathering words. But I remember his hands. He had carpenter's hands, strong and rough and always warm. When he held my face, I felt safe. I felt home. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. I do not know what home means anymore. The village I left does not exist. The country I served is disappearing. The husband I loved is gone. Everything that made me who I was is gone. Greta reached out and took Minna's hand. The gesture needed no translation. We are still here, Greta said quietly. Whatever else changes, we are still here. Maybe that is enough for now. They sat together in the fading light, two women who had lost everything except each other. December 21st, 1944. Captain Ruth Pemberton stood before the assembled prisoners with an announcement that would change the texture of their captivity. In 4 days it will be Christmas, she said, through Lieutenant Stone's translation. I know this is a difficult time to be away from your families, but we will do what we can to make the holiday meaningful. The women listened in silence. Christmas in a prison camp. The irony was not lost on any of them. There will be a special meal, the captain continued. Corporal Aldrich has been planning it for weeks, and we have arranged for a small service in the recreation hall for those who wish to attend. A special meal. Greta thought about the Christmas dinners of her childhood, roast goose with red cabbage, stolen sweet with dried fruits and marzipan, her mother's Lebkuchen, the gingerbread cookies she had been making since before Greta was born. Those memories belonged to another lifetime, another person, another world that had ceased to exist. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall was transformed. Franklin had been working for 3 days straight, The tables were covered with clean white cloths, borrowed from somewhere in the camp's supplies. Candles flickered in the centers, casting warm shadows across the room. The smell of roasting meat filled the air with a richness that made mouths water and eyes sting with unexpected emotion. The meal itself was a masterpiece of improvisation. Roast turkey, golden and glistening, stuffing made with herbs that Franklin had been hoarding for weeks, mashed potatoes whipped until they were clouds, green beans cooked with bacon, cranberry sauce that gleamed like rubies, and for dessert, apple pie with crusts so flaky they shattered at the touch of a fork. The women entered the mess hall and stopped. Several began to cry immediately. Others stood frozen, unable to process the transformation of the utilitarian space into something that looked almost like home. Minna walked slowly to the serving line, where Franklin stood with his usual smile. "Merry Christmas," he said. Minna did not understand all the words, but she understood the sentiment. She reached out and touched his arm, just briefly, just enough to convey something that words could not carry. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "For everything." Franklin nodded. His eyes were suspiciously bright. "Eat," he said. "There's plenty, and if you want seconds—" Minna laughed, a real laugh, the first in longer than she could remember. "I know," she said. Seconds." January 1945 brought the mail delivery that changed everything. Captain Pemberton distributed the letters personally, watching as the German women tore open envelopes with trembling hands. The Red Cross had facilitated the exchange, routing correspondence through neutral channels that somehow still functioned despite the chaos engulfing Europe. Greta received a single thin sheet of paper. The handwriting was her mother's, though shakier than she remembered. The date was October 1944, 3 months earlier. The words had taken 90 days to cross an ocean and a continent. She read them in the common room, while other women read their own letters around her. "My dearest daughter," her mother had written, "we are alive. The bombs have not reached our neighborhood yet. Your father continues to work, though the post office has little to deliver anymore. We manage as best we can." Greta's hands tightened on the paper. "The ration cards allow us 150 grams of bread each day. This is less than before, but we are fortunate compared to many. The Schneiders next door lost their youngest last week. Pneumonia, the doctor said. But we all know the truth. The child was simply too weak. There was not enough food to keep him strong." The words blurred as tears filled Greta's eyes. "I think of you constantly and pray you are safe. The radio says terrible things about the Americans, but I do not believe them. I refuse to believe that my daughter is suffering at the hands of monsters. I choose to believe that somewhere, somehow, you are being treated with the dignity you deserve." Her mother's faith cut deeper than any accusation could have. "We have so little to send you. No packages are allowed, the officials say. But I send you this letter with all my love. Remember who you are, remember where you came from, and remember that no matter what happens, you have a home to return to, a mother who loves you, a father who is proud of you." The letter ended with a single line that Greta would remember for the rest of her life. "Stay strong, my darling. The darkness cannot last forever." Greta looked up from the letter. Around her, other women were reading their own news from home. Some wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. A few had already retreated to the barracks, unable to process their grief in public. The letters painted a picture that no propaganda had prepared them for. Ilse learned that her younger sister had given birth to a baby boy. The infant had lived for 8 days before dying. The cause was simple and brutal. The mother was too malnourished to produce adequate milk. The baby had starved to death in a country that claimed to be fighting for the future of its people. Minna learned that her mother-in-law, the woman who had taught her to cook, was surviving on soup made from grass and roots. The old woman had written cheerfully, claiming she had discovered new recipes, but between the lines, Minna read the truth. Her husband's mother was slowly starving in a nation that had sent its food to feed armies while its citizens withered. Hannelore received news that shattered whatever innocence she had left. Her brother Klaus, just 14 years old, had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the desperate last-ditch defense force composed of children and old men. Boys too young to shave were being handed weapons and told to die for the fatherland. That evening, the mess hall was quiet. 28 women sat before plates of beef stew and fresh bread, the generous portions that had become routine. But tonight, the abundance felt different. Greta stared at her plate. She thought about her mother's letter, 150 grams of bread per day. She thought about the breakfast she had eaten that morning, eggs and bacon and toast and oatmeal. More food in a single meal than her parents received in an entire day. The mathematics was brutal in its clarity. She was eating better as a prisoner of her enemies than her own parents were eating as citizens of her homeland. Minna pushed her plate away after 2 bites. "I cannot," she said in German. "My mother-in-law is eating grass. My husband's memory is being dishonored by my full stomach." The words opened a floodgate. "A child died because there was not enough milk," Ilse added, her voice breaking. "A baby, 8 days old, while we are here asking for seconds." "How can we eat?" Keta asked. "How can we take this food when our families starve?" No one had an answer. The plates grew cold, the stew congealed, the bread sat untouched. Dr. Brennan's weekly weigh-ins told the troubling story. Within days, the pattern became clear. Greta, 98 pounds, down 5 pounds from the previous week. Minna, 91 pounds, down 4. Ilse, 83 pounds, down 3. The progress of months was being undone in days. "They're not eating," Brennan reported to Captain Pemberton. "Or rather, they're eating but not keeping it down. The guilt is making them physically ill. What can we do? Wait. Support them. Help them understand that punishing themselves feeds no one back home." He paused, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was observing. "These women are learning that their country lied to them. That's not a wound that heals quickly." He increased his monitoring to twice weekly, made careful notes in the handwriting that would later become part of the historical record. The body could be measured, the soul was harder to track. February brought a fragile equilibrium. The women still struggled with guilt, still had nights when sleep would not come and food would not stay down, still read and reread letters from home, searching for hope in words that offered little. But gradually, slowly, they began to eat again. Minna returned to the kitchen, found comfort in the familiar rhythms of cooking, discovered that preparing food for others was different from consuming it herself. She could give without feeling she was taking. "I am not eating to enjoy," she explained to Franklin one morning. "I am eating to stay alive, to be strong enough to go home when this ends, to help my mother-in-law, to help whoever survives. I cannot help anyone if I am dead." Franklin nodded. It was not the healthiest philosophy, but it was functional. It would keep her alive until something better took root. February the 13th, 1945. The news came over the radio in broken fragments that Captain Pemberton pieced together from multiple sources. Dresden had been bombed. Not a tactical strike against military targets, but something else entirely. A firestorm that consumed the city center. Tens of thousands dead, perhaps more. The numbers were uncertain. The destruction was not. Greta heard the news and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Dresden, her city, her home. The bakery where she had bought fresh brötchen every morning, the apartment where her parents lived, the streets where she had walked as a child, holding her mother's hand, learning the geography of belonging. Gone. She did not cry. The news was too large for tears, too overwhelming for any normal human response. Instead, she walked to the kitchen, found Franklin preparing lunch, stood in the doorway watching him work, her body present, but her mind 1,000 miles away, imagining flames consuming everything she had ever known. Franklin looked up and saw her face, understood immediately. He turned off the stove, walked to where she stood, placed a hand on her shoulder with a gentleness that broke through her numbness. "I heard," he said simply, "about Dresden. I'm sorry." Greta looked at him. This enemy, this American, this man who had been feeding her for 3 months while her city burned. "My parents," she managed. "I do not know if they—" She could not finish the sentence. Franklin guided her to a chair, made her sit, put a cup of coffee in her hands, hot and strong. Then he sat beside her and said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only appropriate response. They sat together for 20 minutes. The coffee grew cold. The lunch preparation waited. Finally, Greta spoke. "Why do you do this?" Franklin did not pretend to misunderstand. "Do what?" "Show kindness. To enemies. To people whose country is doing—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing all the violence and destruction that words could not capture. "All of this?" Franklin considered the question. It deserved a real answer. Because hungry is hungry. It doesn't matter what uniform someone wore or what country they came from. When a belly is empty, it needs to be filled.
That's the beginning and the end of it. He paused, searching for more words. I can't stop the war. Can't bring back the dead. Can't undo any of the terrible things that have happened. But I can make soup. I can bake bread. I can ask if someone wants seconds. That's what I can do. So that's what I do. Greta absorbed this, turned it over in her mind. Your mother, she said. She sounds wise. Franklin smiled. She is. Wisest person I know. He stood up, returned to the stove.
Resumed preparing lunch. There's work to do, he said. You can help if you want. Sometimes work helps. Greta did not move immediately, but after a moment she rose and joined him at the counter, began peeling potatoes with hands that trembled only slightly. Work helped. Not much, but some. Greta thought the bombing of Dresden was the worst news she would ever receive. She was wrong. In 8 weeks, photographs would emerge from places called Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, and those images would make the destruction of Dresden seem almost merciful, because buildings could be rebuilt. What had been done to human beings could never be undone. March brought news that Greta's parents had survived. The letter arrived through Red Cross channels, written in her father's careful handwriting. Their neighborhood had been on the edge of the firestorm. Their building had sustained damage but remained standing. They were alive, hungry, frightened, but alive. Greta read the letter 3 times before she allowed herself to believe it. We have lost much, her father wrote, but we have not lost each other. That is enough. That must be enough. The relief was overwhelming, but it came wrapped in a new layer of guilt. Her parents were alive, but they were starving in the ruins of their city while she ate 3 meals a day in an American prison camp. The mathematics remained brutal, the equations remained unsolvable. By late March, most of the women had returned to something approaching normal eating patterns. Dr. Brennan's weigh-ins showed stabilization, then gradual gains. The crisis had passed, but the questions remained. If the Americans were not monsters, what did that make the propaganda? If enemies could show kindness, what did that make the war? If abundance existed here in a prison camp, why did scarcity exist at home? These questions lurked beneath the surface of daily life, waiting for the moment when they could no longer be ignored. That moment came in April. April 12, 1945, Captain Ruth Pemberton stood before the assembled prisoners with a newspaper in her hand. Her face was grave. Lieutenant Stone stood beside her, ready to translate. "I have news that you need to hear," the captain began. "News that will be difficult, but you have a right to know what has been done in your country's name." She unfolded the newspaper. The front page was dominated by photographs. American forces have liberated several camps in Germany, camps that were not prisoner of war facilities, camps that were something else entirely, Stone translated. Stone? Her voice was steady, professional, but her hands trembled. The captain held up the photographs. "These images are from a place called Bergen-Belsen and from another called Buchenwald. They show what we found there." Greta looked at the photographs and felt her mind refuse to process what her eyes were seeing. Skeletal figures. Human beings reduced to bones wrapped in skin. Piles of bodies stacked like cordwood. Survivors whose eyes held horrors beyond comprehension. "These people were deliberately starved," Captain Pemberton continued. "They received approximately 200 calories per day, enough to prolong death but not enough to sustain life. They survived on grass and potato peels scavenged from garbage. Many did not survive at all." The translation continued. Stone's voice cracked on certain words, but she pushed through. "The death toll is still being calculated, but it numbers in the millions. Millions of people, systematically murdered. By starvation, by gas, by bullets, by deliberate and calculated cruelty on a scale that defies comprehension." Greta heard the words but could not connect them to reality. 200 calories. She thought about the meals she had eaten over the past 5 months. The generous portions, the second helpings, the abundance that had seemed miraculous. She was receiving 2,500 calories per day, 12 times what the concentration camp prisoners had received. The mathematics was brutal in its clarity. Greta stared at the photographs of skeletal survivors and felt a terrible recognition. The brown flour soup her mother had made. The potato peels boiled into mush. The desperate stretching of nothing into something that could sustain life for one more day. Her mother had been eating the same food as concentration camp prisoners. The only difference was degree. The only difference was time. The line between managing and dying was thinner than a single slice of bread. Minna stood up abruptly and ran from the room. The sound of her retching echoed from the hallway. Ilse sat frozen, staring at a photograph of emaciated bodies, unable to look away. Keta began translating the accompanying article in a monotone voice, as if emotional distance could protect her from the words. The Dachau camp held prisoners who received 200 calories daily, she read. Medical experts estimate that sustained starvation at this level causes death within 8 to 12 weeks. The camp operated for 12 years. Hannah, the youngest, began to cry. Silent tears that rolled down cheeks still round with the weight she had regained. She was 19 years old and learning that her country had committed atrocities beyond imagination. Greta sat in the middle of it all and felt something break inside her, not her heart. That had broken long ago in stages through letters from home and news of Dresden, and the slow realization that everything she had believed was wrong. This was something deeper, something fundamental, the last remaining foundation of her identity crumbling into dust. She had served Germany, operated radios, transmitted messages, contributed to the war effort in her small way. And while she had served, her country had been starving millions of people to death. While she had complained about reduced rations, others had received no rations at all. While she had joined the military for better food, others had been denied food entirely as a method of murder. The guilt was not about eating well in an American camp. The guilt was about being German. That evening, Franklin Aldrich served beef stew and fresh bread. Nobody ate. He sat down at one of the tables, something he rarely did during service, sat across from Minna, whose face was pale and drawn, whose eyes held a devastation that no amount of food could address. "I heard," he said quietly. "About what they found." Minna looked at him. This American. This enemy who had fed her for 5 months. This man who had taught her his mother's recipes and learned her grandmother's in return. "You feed us good," she said in halting English. "You feed us like people." She paused, gathered words that felt inadequate for what she needed to express. My country made people into skeletons on purpose, made them eat grass while we ate bread." Her voice broke. "I did not know, I swear to you, I did not know, but I should have known. I should have asked where the food went, who was hungry, why we ate when others starved." Franklin sat with her words, did not try to minimize them, did not offer false comfort. "The not knowing," he finally said. "That's how evil works. It depends on people not knowing, not asking, not looking too closely at uncomfortable questions. But now I know. Now you know." "So what do I do?" Minna's voice was raw. "How do I live with knowing?" Franklin considered the question. It was the hardest question anyone had ever asked him. "You remember," he said finally. "Every day, for the rest of your life, you remember, and you make choices that honor that memory. You feed people when they're hungry. You show kindness when kindness is hard. You refuse to look away from uncomfortable truths." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "You can't undo what was done. None of us can. But you can make sure it wasn't for nothing. You can make sure the dead are remembered. You can make sure it never happens again." Minna looked at their joined hands. Enemy and enemy, connected by something stronger than politics or war.
"Hungry is hungry," she said slowly, repeating his words from months ago. "That is the truth, yes?" "That's the truth." "Then every meal I cook will be for them. Every person I feed will be a memorial. I will never let anyone leave hungry. Never," Franklin nodded. "That's a start." The revelations continued throughout April. More camps were liberated, more photographs emerged, more stories of systematic cruelty filtered through the newspapers and radio broadcasts. The women of Camp Wheeler absorbed each new horror with diminishing surprise but undiminished grief. They had crossed a threshold beyond which nothing could shock them anymore. They had learned what their country was capable of. Every additional detail simply confirmed what they already knew, but something else was happening alongside the grief. Questions that had been forming since November began to crystallize into understanding. Ilse spoke for many of them one evening in the barracks. "Every time we ask for seconds here," she said, "we prove that food was never actually scarce. The Americans have enough to feed their soldiers and their enemies. The shortage in Germany was not real, it was chosen." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Our government told us there was not enough. They gave us ration cards and apologized for the small portions. But there was enough. There has always been enough. They simply chose to give it to some people and deny it to others." Keta nodded slowly. "The propaganda said Americans would starve us, would treat us like animals. Instead, they feed us better than our own country fed us." "Because the propaganda was lies," Greta said. "All of it. About the Americans, about the food shortage, about everything." She thought about Goebbels, about the radio broadcasts she had transmitted, about the messages she had helped send across the Reich's communication networks. "We were tools," she continued, "tools of a government that was starving its own people while murdering millions more. Tools that were given just enough food to keep working, just enough lies to keep believing." The words hurt to say, but they were true, and truth, however painful, was better than the comfortable lies that had sustained them for years. "What do we do now?" Hannah asked. She was the youngest, the most lost, the most desperate for guidance. Greta did not have an answer. None of them did. But Minna spoke from the corner where she had been sitting in silence.
"We survive," she said. "We go home when this ends. We find whoever is left of our families, and we tell the truth about what we learned here, about what Germany did, about what kindness looks like when it comes from unexpected places." "They will call us traitors," Keta warned. Perhaps. Perhaps we are traitors. Traitors to a system that deserved to be betrayed. Minna stood up. Her voice was stronger now, more certain. "I will not apologize for learning the truth. I will not pretend I did not see what I saw. I will not go back to being a tool for liars and murderers." She looked around at the other women. "When I cook again in Germany, every meal will be a statement. I will feed anyone who is hungry. Anyone, because Corporal Aldrich taught me that feeding your enemy is more powerful than starving them. And because those who died in the camps deserve to be remembered through every act of generosity we can manage." The words hung in the air like a promise, like a beginning. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe. Church bells rang across America. Soldiers wept with relief. Civilians poured into the streets to celebrate the end of the nightmare that had consumed the world for 6 years. At Camp Wheeler, 28 German women gathered in the recreation hall and listened to the news in complicated silence. The war was over. The Reich had surrendered. The future was uncertain, but finally present. Captain Pemberton addressed them with Lieutenant Stone translating. "Transportation will be arranged within the month. You will be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes." She paused, her expression softening. "I know many of you are anxious about what you will find there. The Red Cross will assist in locating family members. I hope that you find more than you fear." After the captain left, the women remained in the hall. None seemed eager to return to the barracks. None knew quite what to say. Greta finally broke the silence. "When we go back, what do we tell people about this place, about how we were treated?" Ilse answered immediately. "The truth, that Americans fed us better than our own government fed its citizens, that our enemy showed us more humanity than our leaders showed to millions, that abundance was always possible and scarcity was always a choice. And if they don't want to hear it, then they need to hear it more." Minna spoke next. "I will not argue with words. I will argue with food, with every person I feed, with every hungry mouth I refuse to turn away." She thought about Franklin, about his mother's philosophy, about the lessons learned over steam and flour and the simple act of nourishing others. "Actions speak louder than words," she said. "Let my kitchen be my testimony." Keta, ever the teacher, added her own resolution. "I will teach, not just mathematics, but truth. I will tell my students what I learned here, about propaganda and lies and the importance of asking uncomfortable questions." Hannah, the youngest, spoke last. "I don't know what I'll do," she admitted.
"I don't know what's left to go home to, but I know what I won't do. I won't be silent. I won't pretend. I won't let anyone tell me that what happened here didn't happen." The promises made in that room would shape the rest of their lives. May 15th, 1945. The trucks arrived at dawn. 28 women stood in the courtyard of Camp Wheeler, their meager possessions gathered in small bundles.
The Wisconsin spring had finally arrived, warming the air that had been so bitter when they first came. Birds sang in trees that were budding with new green. The world was renewing itself, indifferent to the scars that war had left on human hearts. Greta Hoffman stood near the front of the group, watching the American soldiers load supplies onto the transport vehicles. In a few hours, they would begin the journey to the processing center in New York. From there, ships would carry them back across the Atlantic to whatever remained of Europe, to whatever remained of home. She had gained 29 pounds since November. Her cheeks were no longer hollow. Her eyes no longer held the desperate emptiness of chronic starvation. Physically, she had been restored. The body was resilient. It remembered how to be healthy, given half a chance. The mind was another matter. Captain Ruth Pemberton walked among the assembled women, offering final words to each. When she reached Greta, she paused. "I hope you find your family safe," the captain said, through Lieutenant Stone's translation. "I hope Germany can rebuild. I hope that someday this war will seem like a distant nightmare rather than a present wound." Greta nodded. "Thank you, Captain, for everything. Thank Corporal Aldrich, he's the one who insisted on feeding you properly. I just signed the paperwork." Pemberton moved on to the next woman, but Greta's attention had already shifted to the kitchen building, where a familiar figure stood in the doorway. Franklin Aldrich watched the departure preparations with an expression Greta could not quite read. Sadness, perhaps, or satisfaction, or some complicated mixture of both. She broke from the group and walked toward him. They had said preliminary goodbyes 3 days earlier, had shaken hands, had exchanged the words that seemed appropriate for the occasion. But now, in this final moment, those words felt insufficient. Franklin saw her approaching and straightened slightly. "Thought you'd be on the truck by now," he said. "Soon, I wanted to—" She trailed off, uncertain how to finish. Franklin reached into his apron pocket and withdrew a small, worn notebook. The pages were stained with grease and flour, the binding held together with tape that had been applied and reapplied over years of use. "My mother's recipes," he said, holding it out. "The originals. She wrote them down when I was a boy. I've been cooking from memory, but these are the real thing." Greta stared at the notebook. "I cannot take this. It is your family's treasure. That's why I want you to have it." Franklin pressed it into her hands. "These recipes kept my family fed through the Depression, kept strangers fed when they had nothing, kept you fed when you needed it most." He closed her fingers around the worn cover. "Take them back to Germany, cook from them, feed people, and when you do, remember that food is never just food. It's love made edible. It's hope you can taste. It's proof that someone cared enough to nourish you." Greta felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not now."
"I will remember," she said. "Every meal I make, every person I feed, I will remember." Franklin nodded, stepped back. The gesture said what words could not. It was time to go. Greta walked back to the group, climbed onto the truck, found a seat near the back where she could watch the camp recede as they drove away. The last thing she saw was Franklin Aldrich, standing in the kitchen doorway, one hand raised in farewell. Then the truck rounded a corner and Camp Wheeler disappeared from view, but it would never disappear from memory. The journey back to Europe took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of processing centers and paperwork, 3 weeks of medical examinations and interviews, 3 weeks of bureaucracy attempting to impose order on the chaos of millions of displaced persons streaming across a shattered continent. Greta moved through it all in a daze. The notebook never left her possession. She kept it tucked inside her shirt, close to her heart, a talisman against the uncertainty that awaited. The ship that carried them across the Atlantic was nothing like the vessel that had brought them to America. This one was designed for passengers, not prisoners. The food was adequate. The conditions were humane. The journey was almost comfortable. At night, Greta lay in her narrow bunk and listened to the ship's engines thrumming through the hull. She thought about her parents, about Dresden, about what she might find when she finally reached the city of her birth. The ship docked in Le Havre on June 3, 1945. From there, trains carried the former prisoners eastward through France and into Germany. The landscape outside the windows told the story of war more eloquently than any words could. Bombed bridges, burned villages,
Craters where buildings had once stood, the skeleton of a civilization that had torn itself apart. And people, so many people, walking along roads with bundles on their backs, pushing carts loaded with whatever they had salvaged, moving east, moving west, moving in all directions, searching for something that might no longer exist. Home. June 11th, 1945. Greta Hoffmann walked into Dresden, or what remained of it. The city centre was gone. Where buildings had stood, there were now mountains of rubble. Where streets had run, there were now paths cleared through debris. Where people had lived and worked and loved and laughed, there was now silence broken only by the sound of shovels and the occasional rumble of vehicles moving wreckage. Greta stood at the edge of what had once been the Altmarkt, and felt her mind refuse to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. This was not her city. Could not be her city. Her city had churches with soaring spires and cafes with outdoor seating and bakeries that filled the morning air with the smell of fresh bread. This was a graveyard, a monument to destruction on a scale that defied human understanding. Minna had travelled with her, refusing to continue to Hamburg until she knew Greta had found her family. "Where was your home?" Minna asked quietly. Greta pointed toward the east. That direction, perhaps 2 kilometers, the neighborhood was called Johannstadt. They walked. Through ruins and around rubble. Past work crews clearing debris. Past survivors searching for anything salvageable. Past the ghosts of a city that existed now only in memory. Johannstadt had been on the edge of the firestorm. The bombing had been heavy, but not as total as in the center. Some buildings still stood. Some streets were recognizable. Greta turned a corner and stopped. The apartment building where she had grown up was still there, damaged, scarred, half the windows boarded up and the facade pockmarked with shrapnel. But standing, she ran, up the stairs she had climbed thousands of times, past the landing where she had played as a child, to the door of the apartment where she had learned to walk, to talk, to dream. The door was closed. She knocked, waited, knocked again. Footsteps inside, slow, shuffling footsteps that she would have recognized anywhere. The door opened, and there stood Elsa Hoffmann, her mother, 63 years old, grey-haired and thin, and bent by years of hardship. Alive. "Mama," Greta whispered. For a moment neither moved. The mother stared at the daughter she had not seen in 2 years. The daughter stared at the mother she had feared was dead. Then Elsa Hoffmann opened her arms, and Greta fell into them, and the tears that had been held back for months finally broke free. "My girl," Elsa murmured. "My beautiful girl. You came home." They stood in the doorway, holding each other, while the ruins of Dresden stretched out below them, and a new world struggled to be born from the ashes of the old. Heinrich Hoffmann had survived as well. Greta's father was 70 years old now, retired from the postal service, spending his days helping with reconstruction efforts and his evenings sitting by the window watching the city slowly rebuild. He cried when he saw his daughter. This stoic man who had never shown emotion through all the hardships of the war, who had maintained his dignity through rationing and bombing and the collapse of everything he had known, wept like a child when Greta walked through the door. "I prayed," he said, his voice breaking, "every night that you were safe, that the Americans were treating you well, that someday, somehow, you would come back to us." "The Americans were kind," Greta said. "Kinder than we had any right to expect. Kinder than we were told they would be." She pulled out Franklin's notebook, the worn pages, the stained cover, the handwriting of a woman she had never met but felt she knew. "These belonged to a man who fed me when I was starving. His mother's recipes. He gave them to me so I could keep feeding others. Elsie took the notebook with reverent hands, turned the pages slowly, read ingredients and instructions that crossed an ocean. "Tuna casserole," she murmured. "When I have a kitchen again," Greta said, "I will make it for you, and for anyone else who is hungry." The years that followed were hard. Germany lay in ruins. Food remained scarce. The occupation brought its own challenges and humiliations. But slowly, painfully, life resumed. Minna returned to Hamburg and found her mother-in-law alive, but barely. She nursed the old woman back to health. Within a year, she had opened a soup kitchen in the ruins of the city. She called it Die Brücke, the bridge. The line formed every day at noon and did not end until the pot was empty. She fed anyone who came, asked no questions, made no judgments, simply ladled soup into bowls and sent people away less hungry than they had arrived. Within 5 years, Die Brücke had become a model for relief operations across Germany. Within 10 years, Minna had trained dozens of cooks who went on to open their own kitchens. The ripples spread outward, one bowl of soup at a time. Ilse emigrated to Canada in 1948. She found work with refugee organizations, spent 35 years helping displaced persons find new homes. 12,000 people passed through her hands on their way to new lives. Hannah became a nurse in Berlin, specialized in pediatric nutrition, spent her career treating malnourished children, the most vulnerable victims of poverty and neglect. Keta returned to teaching. Her mathematics lessons now included stories about propaganda and the importance of questioning authority. Her students went on to universities and careers built on critical thinking rather than blind obedience. Greta stayed in Dresden for 3 years, helped rebuild, helped feed, helped heal. Her parents died within months of each other in 1947. Heinrich went first, his heart finally giving out. Else followed shortly after, unable to imagine life without the man she had loved for 43 years. Greta buried them side by side in the Johannstadt cemetery, stood over their graves and made a promise. "I will carry what you taught me," she said. "I will carry what Franklin taught me. I will spend my life feeding people and telling the truth. That is the only memorial that matters." She left Dresden in 1948. The Soviet occupation offered limited opportunities for an independent woman with American sympathies. She went west, through refugee camps and processing centers. Through paperwork and interviews, she arrived in America in 1950, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 1955. Greta Hoffman stood outside a small storefront on a quiet street, looking at the for lease sign in the window. The building was nothing special, 1,000 square feet of empty space with a kitchen in the back and room for perhaps 20 tables in the front. But Greta saw something else. She saw a future. She had spent 5 years working in other people's restaurants, learning American business practices, saving every penny, building toward this moment. Now she was ready. She signed the lease, bought equipment with money she had scraped together, painted the walls herself, working late into the night, and she chose a name, The Bridge. The same name Minna had chosen for her soup kitchen in Hamburg. The same concept, the same purpose, a bridge between past and future, between Germany and America, between hunger and hope. The menu was simple: Sauerbraten alongside pot roast, Spätzle next to macaroni and cheese, German dishes and American dishes served side by side, without hierarchy or judgment. And always prominently featured the dish that had changed her life, tuna casserole, made according to the recipe in Franklin Aldrich's mother's notebook. The restaurant opened on September 15, 1955. The first customer was a man who looked vaguely familiar, stocky, weathered face, the kind of build that spoke of farm work and honest labor. Franklin Aldrich had aged in the 10 years since she had seen him last. Grey touched his temples now, lines had deepened around his eyes, but the smile was the same, warm, genuine, without a trace of malice. "Heard you were opening a place, then," he said. "Couldn't miss it." Greta felt tears threatening, but held them back through sheer force of will. "You came?" "Of course I came. Had to make sure you were using my mother's recipes right." He sat down at the counter, looked at the menu. "I'll have the tuna casserole," he said. "And if it's any good, I'll have seconds." Greta laughed, a real laugh, the first in longer than she could remember. "It's good," she promised. "It's the best you'll ever taste." She went to the kitchen and began to cook. 1962. A letter arrived at the bridge addressed to Greta Hoffman. The handwriting was familiar. The postmark was Minnesota. She opened it after the lunch rush, sitting alone in the kitchen where she had spent so many hours over the past 7 years. "Dear Greta," Franklin had written, "I hear the restaurant is doing well. That makes me happy. I always knew you would do something good with what you learned. I'm still on the farm, still cooking for whoever shows up, still doing what my mother taught me. Some things never change, I suppose. You asked me once why I did what I did at Camp Wheeler. Why I fed you and the other women so generously when I didn't have to. I gave you an answer then, but I've been thinking about it more lately and I want to give you a better one. The truth is, I didn't do anything special. I just fed hungry people. That's not heroism, that's not bravery. That's just basic human decency. The fact that it seemed special to you tells me more about what you went through than anything else could. Keep cooking, keep feeding, keep proving that kindness is possible even when the world seems determined to prove otherwise. Your friend, Franklin." Greta read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the notebook with his mother's recipes. He was wrong, of course. What he had done was special, extraordinary even. But she understood what he meant. For Franklin, feeding the hungry was as natural as breathing. He could not imagine doing otherwise. That was precisely what made it remarkable. The ordinary can be extraordinary when practiced with sufficient consistency. 1965. Greta Hoffman, 45 years old, stood in the kitchen of the bridge and watched her daughter Anna learning to make spätzle. The girl was 12, born in America, raised on stories of war and redemption that seemed like ancient history to her young mind. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's American optimism. A child of 2 worlds, belonging fully to both. "Mama," Anna said, her hands buried in dough, "why do you always make so much food? Why don't you ever let anyone leave hungry?" Greta set down her spoon, wiped her hands on her apron, sat down across from her daughter. "During the war," she began, "I was captured by American soldiers, taken to a prison camp in Wisconsin. I expected to be starved, to be treated like an animal. Everything I had been told about Americans suggested they would be cruel." Anna listened with the focused attention of a child hearing something important. "Instead, I found a man named Franklin Aldrich, a cook. He served me a plate of food so full it nearly spilled over, and when I finished, he asked if I wanted more." Greta pulled out the old notebook. Its pages were yellowed now, the binding reinforced multiple times, the stains of 20 years of cooking layered over the original marks. "This notebook contains his mother's recipes. He gave it to me when I left the camp. He said that food is love made edible. Hope you can taste. Proof that someone cared enough to nourish you." She pressed the notebook into Anna's flour-dusted hands. "Every meal I've cooked for the past 20 years has been a memorial to the people who died because they were denied food, a memorial to the kindness that saved my life, a memorial to the truth that abundance exists, that scarcity is often a choice, that feeding people is the most important thing we can do. Anna looked at the notebook, at her mother, at the kitchen that had been the center of their family's life for as long as she could remember. So when I ask if someone wants seconds, you're asking if they know they matter, Greta finished. You are asking if they understand that they deserve to be full. You are asking if they believe that kindness exists, even in a world that has shown them cruelty. Anna nodded slowly, the weight of the lesson settling into her young bones. I understand, Mama. Good. Greta stood up, returned to her stove. Now finish those spätzle. We have customers to feed. 1987. Franklin Aldrich died on a cold Minnesota morning, 77 years old. He passed away in his sleep, in the farmhouse where he had been born, surrounded by the land his family had worked for 3 generations. The funeral was small, family and neighbors, a few old friends from the war years. Greta received the news by telephone. She sat in the kitchen of the bridge for a long time afterward, holding the notebook that had traveled so far. She did not cry. Franklin would not have wanted tears. He would have wanted her to keep cooking, keep feeding, keep doing what needed to be done. That evening she made tuna casserole, his mother's recipe, the dish that had started everything. She served it to the dinner customers and told them, briefly, about the man who had taught her to cook, about his philosophy, about his mother's belief that turning away the hungry was a sin. He didn't think he did anything special, she said, but he did. Every day, for his whole life, he did something special. He fed people. She returned to her kitchen and continued working. That was the memorial Franklin would have wanted. 1991. Wilhelmina Hartmann, called Minna by everyone who knew her, died in Hamburg at the age of 75. Die Brücke, the soup kitchen she had founded 45 years earlier, had served an estimated 2.3 million meals. It had become an institution in Hamburg, a symbol of what was possible when one person decided to make a difference. Her last words, according to the nurse who attended her, were, "Is everyone fed?" The question was vintage Minna. Even at the end, even with her strength failing, she was thinking about others, about the hungry, about the ones who needed nourishment. Greta received the news and wept for the first time in years. Minna had been more than a friend. She had been a fellow traveler on a journey that began in the mess hall of Camp Wheeler and ended only with death. But the journey continued in others, in the cooks Minna had trained, in the soup kitchens that had sprung up following her example, in the thousands of people who had eaten her food and carried her philosophy forward. Minna was gone, but what she had built remained. 1995. Greta Hoffmann, 75 years old, sat in her daughter's living room with a tape recorder running. Anna's daughter, Greta's granddaughter, had asked for the story, wanted to preserve it before it was too late, wanted future generations to know what had happened and why it mattered. Greta spoke slowly, carefully, choosing each word with precision. The lesson from Camp Wheeler was not about heroes and villains, not about good Americans and bad Germans, not about the simplistic stories that people prefer to tell. She paused, gathered her thoughts. The lesson was this: cruelty needs silence to survive. It needs people who do not ask questions, who do not look too closely, who accept easy answers because hard truths are uncomfortable. Another pause. And kindness? Kindness does not need heroes. It does not need grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. It only needs one person, one ordinary person, who remembers that hungry is hungry, that bellies do not have nationalities, that enemies are human beings too. She thought about Franklin, about his mother's philosophy, about the ripples that spread outward from one small act of generosity. Every meal I cooked in 50 years was a reminder of that truth. Every person I fed was a statement that I would not be silent, that I would not look away, that I would do my small part to ensure that the darkness never returned. The tape recorder hummed. The afternoon light slanted through the windows. I am old now, tired, my time is running short, but the lessons live on, in Anna, in you, in everyone who has eaten at my table and heard my stories and understood what seconds really means. She smiled, the smile of someone who had found peace with her past. That is enough. That has always been enough. 1998. The Bridge restaurant closed after 43 years of operation. Greta was too old to cook anymore. Anna had her own career, her own family, her own life to lead. There was no one to take over the business. But on the last day, something remarkable happened. A line formed outside. Not customers looking for a meal, something else. People who had eaten at the Bridge over the years, people whose lives had been touched by Greta's generosity. People who had heard her stories and carried them forward. They came to say goodbye. Former refugees who had found their first American meal at Greta's counter. German immigrants who had tasted home in her Sauerbraten. American regulars who had learned to appreciate Spätzle and the woman who made it. They came by the dozens, then by the hundreds. They filled the small restaurant and spilled out onto the sidewalk. They shared stories, shed tears, embraced a woman who had fed them, and in feeding them, had changed them. Greta stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed and grateful. "Thank you," she said, again and again. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for remembering." But the visitors were the ones who thanked her for the food, for the stories, for the lesson that generosity matters, that kindness persists, that one person with a pot and a purpose can make a difference. March 17th, 2001. Margaret Hoffman died peacefully in her sleep. She was 81 years old. In her final days, she asked Anna to read from the old notebook. The recipes, the stained pages, the handwriting of Franklin's mother, preserved across decades and continents. Tuna casserole, Anna read. 2 cans of tuna, 1 package of egg noodles, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup, 1 cup of milk, 1 cup of breadcrumbs, butter for topping. Greta smiled. Simple ingredients, she murmured. That's the secret. Simple ingredients made with love. That's all it takes to change the world. She closed her eyes. "Is everyone fed?" she asked. Anna remembered Minna's story, the last words of the woman who had run Die Brücke for 45 years. "Yes, Mama," Anna said. "Everyone is fed," Greta nodded. The tension left her body. The struggle ceased. She died, with a smile on her face. Epilogue. Every Thanksgiving, Anna Hoffman makes tuna casserole. She uses her grandmother's recipe, Franklin Aldrich's mother's recipe. The same dish that was served in a Wisconsin prison camp in November 1944, when 28 starving German women learned that enemies could be kind. Anna's children know the story. Her grandchildren know it too. They know about Greta and Franklin, about Minna and her soup kitchen, about Ilse and her refugees, about Hannah and her patients, about Keta and her students. They know that one word, spoken casually by a man who was simply doing what his mother taught him, changed the course of dozens of lives. Seconds. Such a simple word, such a simple offer, but in that simplicity lay something profound. The recognition that hungry people deserve to be fed, that enemies are human beings, that kindness costs nothing and pays dividends forever. The lesson passes from generation to generation. At Anna's Thanksgiving table, when the plates are empty and the conversation lulls, someone always asks the question, "Would anyone like seconds?" And the answer is always yes. Because seconds is not just about food, It is about hope. It is about humanity. It is about the bridge between what was and what might be. It is about the truth that Franklin Aldrich understood instinctively, that Greta Hoffman learned through suffering, that all of us must remember if we are to survive. Hungry is hungry. Feed the hungry. Always ask if they want more.